All right, guys, in this video, we are going to be reacting to Tim Keller, the late pastor, author, voice in Christian circles, and he's addressing the problem of why so much suffering in the world, and with all the suffering in the world, how can there be a God? So it's a question that's been wrestled with for thousands of years and will continue to be wrestled with for a very long time, but that's because it's a super important question to have an understanding as you shape your theology and as you figure out what you believe in the world and how it fits within the greater picture of Christianity and who Jesus is. So we're going to take a watch here of how Tim Keller answers this question at Columbia University, and we'll see what he says.
At the end of 12 years of religious education, I was an atheist, and then I came to Columbia. The sticking point in all that regarding religion for me was the Holocaust. I looked at that and I said, how is it possible that 6 million people could be exterminated in the course of a war that took 80 million lives and there could be a God? How do you answer that question?
I'm going to push back and ask you, there sounds like there's two motives behind the question. Maybe they're both true for you. They're both very important questions. One is how could European civilization, which is based on Christianity for 1,000 years, produce something like that? Or was it
It's a good question.
much more general, and that is, how in the world could God allow that kind of evil and suffering?
That's the question I want.
The second one.
Yeah, the second one. Much more interesting.
Well, the first one is
Interesting.
is a terrible question too. I mean, it's a terrible question to answer for a Christian minister. But
Let me just say here, the first question: how could a civilization or a country that was based on Christian ideals and principles produce what led to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust? I know this is something that we talk about often, but all it takes is a little bit of a lie to pollute something, and then the trajectory of that thing can end up 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And it's the religious system of the Jewish people, God's chosen people, that got the law from God that ended up killing Christ in the flesh. So it's a profound question, and it's a deep question, but it's by no means a new question or something that we don't have precedence for.
I think also even from Cain and Abel was like the first time when killing happened, like that was aside from how it was supposed to be, Yeah. And so it didn't really take that long for us to screw it up.
No, pretty quick.
Yeah, but I do already really love and respect the humility that Tim Keller comes into this with, because he's not. I think it would be very easy on a stage to get very defensive. I think he's coming in saying like, yeah, this is a really hard question. Because he has sat there as a pastor. He's answered a lot of these questions a lot, and he's not. I like that he's not being defensive right now. I like that he's wrestling alongside this guy, at least in this moment, because this is not a place to be defensive. It's a place this is a hard question. This is a sad topic, like you have to come in with humility, because it's a big question.
Yeah. I mean, it's a horrible question that even has to be asked, but I mean, Christ's most sharp rebuke was for those who claimed to be religious and weren't. So was everybody for the 1,000 years leading up to the Holocaust actually leading genuine Christian lives based off of biblical principles and, as the New Testament writers would say, the law of love? No, I can't say that the thing that undergirds the Holocaust framework was built on that, but rather a perversion of that. And so anyway, I just think it's a really good question that he's posing, that I don't know if a lot of people have asked as much, but it looks like they're going down the trail of question 2. So we'll see what he says.
As a pastor, I have to say that the Holocaust is awful, and yet as a pastor for the last 35 years, I've been sitting in rooms with people, as a pastor, with parents whose little, 2-year-old get run over by a car. I mean, it doesn't seem like a Holocaust, but it's the same kind of misery, the same question. Yeah. Why in the world would God allow evil and suffering? So I've been through it and through it and through it and through it. The right response to anyone who's actually in the middle of suffering is silence and love and speaking when spoken to. I've given to people over the years when they've asked me. The one is, I actually don't believe it makes it any easier to handle or face suffering by disbelieving in God. And I actually...
Okay. Completely agree with Tim Keller that when somebody's experiencing, some of the worst moments of their life and suffering and things that are unexplainable, that it is good to be quiet and to be patient and to sit with people and to be loving. From a theological standpoint, he just made the claim, I don't believe it makes it any easier, whether you believe or disbelieve in God. I'm probably going to push back and go in a separate direction from Tim Keller on this. And there's plenty of theologians and authors that have contributed all sorts of amazing things to the body of Christ. And it doesn't mean 100% of everything that ever left their human mouths was accurate. And so this would just be one of those areas where I'm like, hey, I think that this is something Tim and I would see differently. I think Paul in the New Testament goes out of his way to say, hey, those of us that believe in God, we don't grieve like those who don't know God. I think that is a foundational statement of like, hey, we interact with suffering and grief and endurance and persecution and laying down our life differently than those who don't believe in God. Because obviously we do. There's a hope attached to that. And, hope is what kind of can put wind in the sail at times. It's what can keep endurance going. So I don't know if that comment kind of hit you in a weird way or if you see it differently.
I don't feel like that's how I would have led off if I was him. Like even if you're going to build something on that, it's as a writer, you're looking for your headline to make your first impression, and to me that's not the first impression. There's so many other things that need to be said to me before that. But I will also say he might not have even had the questions beforehand, and so he might be shooting from the hip, and he's building his argument on the fly. He's building the boat as it's being pushed out to sea, and so I am curious to see where he goes.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's hard to get your words perfectly in order when you're on a stage and you're addressing a question impromptu. So I'm not trying to overly grill Tim Keller, who contributed so many good things. It's just more like as we're reviewing this, and we have the privilege of kind of listening and responding, that's just a point theologically that I'd probably edit the way that's phrased. But yeah, we can jump back in.
I actually do Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. He says, how do you know that a human deed is unjust, or a law? But he's talking about law, but how do you know a human law or deed is unjust? Only if there's a higher law that says it's unjust. Otherwise, what you've got out there is the strong eat the weak. That's how you and I got here. If there's no God, you and I came here through stronger organisms eating the weak organism, natural selection. That's what life's about.
This is the
that's
atheist
utterly
worldview.
Natural.
Yeah.
Now, deep in our hearts, we feel, no, that's not right. But, the question is why. Now, what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying is we believe that strong eating the weak is unjust and wrong because there's a higher law. If there was no higher law, he says, how do you even really justify your outrage?
And yet the strong eat the weak every single day.
Yes.
So why doesn't God intervene and say, you know what? You can't kill all those people. Stop
He does
it.
intervene.
Well, I said there were two responses. The first response only is that it doesn't make it any easier. I mean, it really doesn't, because now, on what basis am I morally outraged? If strong eating the weak is natural, so what? So they did it. Stronger nations eat weaker nations, stronger individuals. So what's the big deal? What's the problem? I mean, that's fair. I mean, I mean that's not a complete answer, but it's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, just real quick, this is the atheist problem. Like, the atheist problem is, how do you ever get to be mad about an injustice? What does injustice even mean? Like, you're you're going against what justice is, and justice is something outside of you. I mean, it's the classic moral argument, but like I said, it's one that there's no bottom to it. It's what people are wrestling with all their days on this earth, essentially. And so, I just think I've never heard a good answer for how to solve that problem of the strong eating the weak and everything's just natural selection in the atheistic worldview.
Yeah, I think that the very presence of a sense of justice that says that the way that life is not enough for an atheist is a problem, because why would it be? Why like, of course, well, so I think a lot of times what they might say is, well, you know, we evolved socially because this was beneficial socially, but social is not the same as good. And they're not going to say, they're going to also say, no, that this is right. This is about right and wrong. And that's where it starts to break down, because it's like, but it always comes back to, where does your universal standard of right and wrong come from? It always comes back to that. Right. Yeah. Because there isn't one with an atheistic person, or there can't be one that has weight, unless you maybe say, well, the majority say this, so it's right. Right. But like, even so, what if there's a bigger planet with 3 times more people and they think eating babies is fine? Does that mean you're outvoted and you have to think that's fine now? Because we would not agree with that.
According to that. Yeah, according to that. And I mean, and again, this is just kind of it's the problem that I see with the atheistic train of thought every single time. It's like, all right, what's actually the majority? You know, what the consensus puts together, that is morality. That is where we get the standard from. And it's like, okay, well, isn't y'all's claim that the majority thought slavery was okay 200 years ago? So does that mean that it was? Well,
it's actually not. Yeah, that's not where that comes from in their heart.
Well, it'll switch, and then they'll say, yeah, but that was actually wrong because I know it was wrong. We all know it was wrong. So now they're deferring to some sort of like conscious
universal.
That they think, it's just this universal, and it's just, you go into this circle over and over and over. I think it would be a breath of fresh air if an atheist did want to disagree with Christian ethics, fine. But then if they would just say, hey, you know what? I don't actually know what is a better answer. I don't have an answer for you, but I just don't like the Christian one. It's like, all right, well, I disagree with you, but at least you're not contradicting yourself.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's like, if an atheist came and said, hey, the question is actually about, is God a good God? Like, and if God is not a good God, that is a problem for Christianity, right? So like,
big problem.
But that's not the way that the question is ever asked, right? And so like, we can wrestle with that one as well. Like that question's been asked since the garden. But anyway.
And this is extremely important to a question about suffering, because suffering implies that something that should not be happening is happening to someone that does not deserve it. And words like should and deserve are morally charged words.
Yes.
So you have to understand where you're getting your moral law and standard from, which I think he's touching on. But let's see how he builds this up.
Say, now as an atheist, now how am I dealing with evil and suffering? Now I really have only a visceral reaction to it. I don't even have a real cogent warrant for saying this is absolutely got to stop, other than I don't like it. But the second is, now you were raised, you went to Catholic school. The Christian view of God is very different than the other views of God, because the Christian view of God is that God came into this world and suffered. Now, I have a cat, and my wife and I love our cat, and we actually saw it once. We broke its leg by accident, but we fixed it for only $1,000, which we never in a million years would have thought we would ever do for a cat.
But well, you broke it, so
we broke the cat.
You're kind of morally obligated.
And it suffered. However, I think it's fair to say, because it doesn't have the same kind of self-consciousness, I would say that a human being suffering is probably at least sort of some kind of higher order. You're more aware of things. There's more agony than a. If God really came to earth in Jesus Christ, and the suffering he went through on the cross voluntarily would have been far beyond my suffering. Now, what does that do? It does.
Yeah, I do want to say
it's a good point.
That is an interesting observation. Like, I don't think that's one that many people have considered or pondered that thought. It's like, we would believe that we're more aware and we take in reality in a more tangible and real and deep way than a cat or animals do. And so there is this kind of interesting thought. It's like, well, how much more the Son of God? Like, yeah, he was human, but he also could know the hearts of people sometimes, and he clearly tapped into the supernatural in a way that you and I don't, and the way that everybody else doesn't. And so it's like, man, just not that his physical and recorded death wasn't already unimaginable, but was there also a layer, like emotionally, psychologically, awareness that we can't even comprehend that played into his suffering? I think that's a really interesting thought that the scriptures don't answer for us, but we can kind of wrestle with.
But it makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
is not, even after you believe that God would have come down and become vulnerable to suffering and death, that does not yet give us an answer to the question of what the reason is that God allows evil and suffering. But it does tell us what the reason isn't.
And I think this is the thing that critics of Christianity miss. I mean, I think they miss it a lot. It's like, well, if God's so good, then why does this happen? And so I'm not believing in that God. And it's like, have you actually stopped to consider what all the other options, what their answer is to this?
Or what your answer is as an atheist?
Well, yeah. And he kind of started there. He was like, hey, well, according to your worldview, these are just atoms running into each other, natural selection, so you can't be upset anyways. But if you're thinking people have internal dignity and worth from something transcendent, and that's why you're mad when somebody gets unjustifiably murdered, then we have to figure out where that's coming from. And so from there, you have to choose your options. And so Christianity is just one of your options to choose from. Like Buddhism, for example, they would say you just want to escape all of life's happenings through detachment. Just detach. Well, that's also probably going to detach you from meaning. And you're also supposed to be detached from pleasure. So now you're not seeking pleasure, you're not seeking meaning, you're not seeking connection. That sounds like nihilism anyways.
Yeah, you're not living.
You're not living, yeah. You're just like a corpse. Hinduism, they say you're just supposed to endure it so that you get a reward for karma. The more suffering you endure in this life, then the next life you're going to... And that has all sorts of problems with it. So you're telling me now I have to endure suffering just for like a bigger paycheck, essentially? I don't know how many people would actually sign up for that. Islam, they tell you to submit to the suffering that you're enduring because it's all part of Allah's will. God's will is for you to suffer right there in that way. And then, we already talked about atheism and naturalism. And then Christianity says, hey, this is what happened in the garden. Free will is real. We've given people free will to choose. God enters into it. God experiences it, shares into it, then he redeems it, and then he promises he's going to end it forever. He's going to destroy it forever. So I'm having a hard time understanding how the Christian God is the one that gets the most flack and the most shade on suffering, when out of all the options available, it's by far the most satisfying.
There are many places and times when we believe someone deserves to have a horrible punishment and they don't get it. And because of God's mercy, God says, he's abounding in mercy. And because of that, a lot of times that creates the ability to have more suffering when God is being slow to anger and trying to give people a chance to change their ways. If God came down and immediately righted all the wrongs, killed Hitler, killed everyone that was involved in the Holocaust, that would have stopped the suffering and it would have immediately destroyed sin. And so how often, if the definition of sin is anything against God's will, and anybody watching this video probably knows what the Christian definition of sin is. We'd all have been wiped off the face of the earth really long ago.
Oh yeah, long time ago. Yeah, and that's actually a good point too, because everybody thinks that they're a good person, And they really have two categories. It's like themselves, good person, and then there's like
trying
murderers.
Really hard. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but then like the only real bad people are like murderers and serial killers and people that do things to women and children. Like, but me and all of my sin, I'm good. And it's like, well, do you actually even want a perfect being to exist? Like, do you even want a perfect good being to be ruling the universe? Because if they are perfect, then that's their standard. Like, they're perfectly good. But that is who you want calling the shots. You don't want somebody corrupt. And if that's the standard of good, well, it's like, dude, you should be out a long time ago. Why would you think that your sin is any less dirty or anything? If you're not perfect, you're under the threshold regardless of how not perfect you are. And that's why Jesus says, like, whoever's done this in his heart, he's committed this. Whoever's done this with his eyes, his ears, he's done this. It's like, yeah, it makes sense. So, I mean, with that being said, it's like we have to humble ourselves and understand that although we don't know the exact why behind it, God's patience for evil is beyond our comprehension. Like, he was patient for hundreds of years with people groups in the Old Testament that were murdering children, murdering women, doing things that we truly can't even imagine before his judgment finally came. And then here we are, 2,000 years later, and we have this chronological snobbery to accuse God of being genocidal and evil and wiping people out. And you have no idea the actual patience he gave those people groups for hundreds of years sometimes. So it just goes to show, like, when people are ignorant of what Scripture actually teaches, they're going to come up with all of these caricatures of God and then project a lot of their own personal problems onto that caricature.
I think it's also, just the problem that we cannot fully see what sin looks like on this side of reality. And if the way I think about it, and this helps me a lot, is that if I only knew what sin was really like, I would agree with everything God has done. And I genuinely believe that. I mean, that sounds really weird coming out of my mouth at knowing what we're talking about, right? Like, horrible things. But the only way you can come at this is like, well, if God is just and good, or two things we believe about God, then that has to be true. Even if it's hard to believe on this side of reality without knowing what sin is and knowing the realities of what is happening on the other side where we can't see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I mean, just the last point, and we'll get back to Tim Keller. It's
other Tim.
Yeah. This idea.
I'm other Tim, but
yeah, you're Tim too in this scenario.
Yeah.
Like this idea that God enters into the suffering cannot be understated. Like, this is what makes Christianity so unique. It's the fact, like, when we say, oh, it's not a religion, it's a relationship. Like, it's become kind of a cheesy catchphrase, but there's a deep, deep truth in that. Like, and it is a religion for those that think it's not. Yes, it is. But it is also a relationship. And it is borderline impossible to have a flourishing, deep relationship with somebody that you cannot relate to. If they feel, light years apart from you in relatability, it's really hard to have a relationship. And we're now talking about God and creation, humans and the Creator. And the fact that he put on human flesh and stepped into the suffering of the world, and by no means did he have to, and endured it to the fullest extent. And then Scripture would go on to say, like, we now have a high priest in Jesus that can sympathize with anything that we experience. And so when people go into their prayer life and they're praying to the Father with Jesus, like, and they have a high priest that actually has been through and experienced what they're experiencing, that's a different level of intimacy. Like, that's a different level of commitment. That's a different level of loyalty. And no other worldview offers that scenario. Every other worldview has some sort of naturalistic, earn it, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, God's very distant, and you can only imagine one day to ever even have contact with him. Like, they're just totally different worldviews. So I think that's the linchpin in this before we even dive into the actual answer. It's, if God wasn't good, why would he send his son? So now we need to see suffering and how we process suffering through the lens of God's good. So now how do we make sense of this? So I don't know, we can continue.
Yep. It can't be that he doesn't love us or he wouldn't have come down and gotten involved.
Right.
It can't be that he doesn't care or he wouldn't be involved. I don't know what the reason is he hasn't stopped it yet, but it can't be a lack of, it can't be a remoteness. It can't be indifference or he wouldn't have come and gotten down involved. Now that assumes you believe the gospel. But if you believe the gospel, what it does is it keeps off the idea of indifference and says, I don't know why he hasn't stopped evil and suffering. But whatever the reason is, it can't just be indifference, hardness of heart, or lack of
Well,
love.
have you thought about it in terms of, the reason?
I mean,
Why didn't he come down and stop the Holocaust?
I don't know. But now, at this point, you've got to ask yourself a question.
Real quick, this kind of goes to your point now. It's like, well, where's the line of how bad something needs to be for God to step in and intervene? It's like, all right, well, the Holocaust, pretty bad. All right, but, what about the innocent person that was just murdered? Just one person. But there's someone's mom, there's someone's dad, there's someone's sibling. Should God have stepped into that? What about the natural disaster that takes out 1,000 people? Should God have stepped into that? It's like, when you really think about it, it's like, oh, well, actually, now God is stepping into a million things every day, every second. And if he stepped into the Holocaust but not into the death of your mother, does that mean he didn't care about your mother, but he cared about you know what I'm saying? Like, there's so many questions that then get birthed out of that. And I think what the Bible would teach, that free will is real, and and even creation groans, because creation is infected with sin. It wasn't God's initial design for animals to have to eat other animals, for example. I think the biblical account gives us the most rational answer as to how all this works, but I digress. We can keep going.
If you can't think of a reason, does that mean there really can't be one? That's the Alvin Plantinga.
Right.
Have you heard the no-seems? Oh, this is good. You'll like this. Okay.
Lay it on me.
All right. Well, now, you're an academic, so you realize philosophers talk like this. Neither of us are really philosophers, but you do know how they talk.
I do indeed.
Okay. He says, if you look into a pup tent and I ask you, do you see any St. Bernards? And if you don't see any St. Bernards, you say, no, I don't see any St. Bernards. Then we can safely conclude there probably are no St. Bernards in the tent, because if there were a St. Bernard in the tent, you'd probably see it. But he said, if you look into a pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? Now, no-see-ums, if you live near the Great Lakes, are little gnats that are so small they come through the screen and bite you anyway. And he says, so if you look into the pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? And you say, no, I don't see any see-ums. I don't see any no-see-ums. That doesn't mean that there aren't any no-see-ums in there, because if there were, you couldn't see them. And he says, now, when you say, because I can't think of any good reason why God would continue to allow evil and suffering to happen, therefore there can't be one, you're assuming that whatever reasons there would be more like St. Bernard's than no-see-ums. Well, why should it be? I mean, he says this is probably cold comfort. Without the gospel of Jesus Christ coming into the earth and coming alongside of us, it's cold comfort. But what he's saying is, you can't assume that just because you can't think of a good reason why God hasn't stopped it yet, there can't be any. And then the gospel says, well, whatever that reason would be, it can't be a lack of love.
Yeah, I mean, I love the fact that Keller addresses two things. He first establishes that you cannot first accuse that it's a lack of love, because the cross, everything Jesus did and everything Jesus represented, completely extinguishes any idea of whether God's good or not. And then kind of the second point in the way he answers this is like, hey, just because you're not able to discern and figure out why something terrible is happening doesn't mean there's not reasons for it. Doesn't mean there's not something God's going to make good out of it. And that's not me saying that God is doing something bad so that he can make something good. I don't think God needs sin and needs evil and needs suffering to then do something good. I think free will is real. And the vast majority of what we would call malevolent behavior comes from other free-willed beings. But even in then, God can still use things for a greater purpose. And the only other thought that just comes to mind is Paul in the New Testament says that our present sufferings are not even worth comparing to the future glory and riches that are in Christ Jesus when we dwell with him in the age to come. And so I think the Bible has a unique and fantastic answer for the problem of suffering, even if it doesn't answer the why behind every individual moment. And I think that Tim Keller did a good job kind of putting that into 2 quick points.
Yeah, I agree. And he did write a book called The Reason for God, and that talks a lot about, like, the very first chunk of it talks about this idea that somehow in some way that the end will be better, even if suffering has happened. Like basically the idea is, in some way the end will be better because the suffering happened. And that to me is obviously, like, that's hard to think about right now, but if you are if you're a Christian and you're kind of struggling to think about, like, how in the world does this all fit together, you have to remember that, like, the end is not death in the Christian worldview. The end is actually, this life is a very short part of eternity, and what's going to happen next. And so we think about in stories people who suffer for the first third of the movie, and then have a wonderful overcoming story, as that's a good story. But because we see death as the end, if someone dies, then that's a bad story. It's a terrible story. That's okay. Yeah, I agree. That's how I feel too. But if you think about it from an eternal standpoint, there's this idea that what if there is this massive end to the story that completely redeems the story. Yeah. And so I don't know, I think that's an interesting idea. I think C.S. Lewis says something about the idea that God will make all the bad things untrue in the end. Yeah, I think that's a cool take on it as well.
Yeah, and again, there is this silver lining that the Christian worldview offers, that and it is obviously a Christian fiction book, but just like in the Chronicles of Narnia, when Aslan finally breathes on the land and all the frozen and snow-covered grass warms up and turns into this luscious green, and the trees start sprouting their leaves and the animals come back to life. It's like there's coming a day where God's going to breathe back on the planet, and all the sin is going to be fixed and restored. And I don't think it's just a 50-50 swap. I don't think it's just a replacing of what you lost. I think the story of Job is very archetypal, and the layers are very deep. And I think the way that he was paid back tenfold, 100-fold, I think Scripture and Christ echo that in the New Testament when they talk to us about the age to come, and for those that endure, and the prize and the reward that await those who put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. So I really enjoyed Tim Keller's take on that. If you made it this far in the video and you have additional thoughts, your own experiences, stories with this, please feel free to share them in the comments. We'd love to chat with you, and we'll catch you on the next video.